thank you very much to BGS and CO2 GeoNet for the invitation to speak today. So I'm the scene-setting talk, really matching the title of the event. So I'll talk to you on CO2 storage being an essential part of meeting the Paris Agreement targets. My name's Tim Dixon. I'm from the IPIECA. We're an international research organisation funded by our 33 member countries and companies. We were set up by the International Energy Agency, but we are not the International Energy Agency themselves, but I do have their permission to use their slides and their material. So just to be clear on that. And for those of you in the audience who may not know what CCS is, or carbon capture and storage, it's basically looking at large point sources of CO2, capturing the carbon dioxide from those, and sticking it very deep beneath the ground in geological formations where the intention is it's retained from the atmosphere. It does not reach the atmosphere. And those large point sources can be power stations based on fossil fuel, such as you see here, coal-based power stations and gas, or they can be bioenergy, biomass power stations. There can be industrial sources such as iron and steel plants, cement plants, and refineries, any large point sources of CO2. So that's a quick 101 on what CCS is. And why are we even looking at this? Why are we concerned with something, this combination of technologies to capture CO2 from being emitted to the environment? Well, I'll start with the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. It's 3 years old now, 2014, but these reports are so important. They summarise the state of knowledge on climate change and mitigation options. 2,000 authors and expert reviewers involved, and what this last Fifth Assessment Report said, obviously it reinforced the messages on climate change. Human influence is clear, but also they pointed out that we do have the means to limit climate change now, and we could do that in an economically sustainable way. But who are the main offenders for the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change? Well, it's slightly hard to read, but the cloud on the left of the screen is the energy sector. That is the largest offending area of economic activity creating CO2 emissions. Also agriculture, forests and land use, and industrial sources. So these are the culprits, and that is the bad news. But there's also good news in this, in that the energy sector and the industrial sectors are characterized by being large point sources of CO2 that lend themselves to the CO2 being captured from their emissions. And that's where CCS comes in. And as the IPCC points out, we have many of the technologies today to do low carbon energy and no carbon energy. CCS is one of those technologies. And they also, in this AR5, put an increased emphasis on bioenergy with CCS. Now that is important because that is a negative emission technology. And this schematic provided by Ecofis shows the sort of net carbon balance, comparison between generating power from fossil fuels with bioenergy, which is considered renewable because you're just releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere that was recently captured through photosynthesis. But if you then put capture plant on that, capture that carbon dioxide released by that energy conversion process and store that CO2 in the ground, you've got a carbon negative process that is actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report say we need to be doing a lot of that. They also did a sensitivity analysis for the role of all the different low carbon energy technologies in order to meet the 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. And what this analysis shows is that we need all of the low carbon energy technologies. If you take out bioenergy, the costs go up by about 64%. Solar or wind taken out, the costs go up. Nuclear taken out, the costs go up. But the costs go up the most if CCS is removed, by an average of 138%. And even more powerful than that, the numbers in the cylinders are the number of model runs that were successful in achieving 450 parts per million. Out of 11 model runs they did, only 4 could achieve 450 without CCS. And the reason for that is because whilst we do have alternatives for electricity generation, we don't have to have CCS on fossil power generation. We can have nuclear, wind and solar. There are other CO2 sources such as iron and steel production and cement production where there are no low carbon alternatives. And if you don't have CCS on those, then everything else, all the other sectors, have got to do even more work. So that's why their analysis shows that actually CCS is the most important of the low carbon energy technologies. So my colleagues at the International Energy Agency produced through their Markel energy modelling the least cost options for achieving the emissions reductions agreed by our politicians. And they look up to 2050 normally. And this shows, looking at the 6-degree scenario, which is the business as usual emissions trajectory, and what's needed to get down to the lower part of that wedge diagram, which is 2 degrees at the end of the century. And those are the roles of the different low carbon energy technologies. We need them all. Again, it says that, emphasizes that message, and CCS has a critical role in there of about 12%. But this is now in the context of the Paris Agreement, a great result by 195 countries, and as we all know, it's now not just 2 degrees C, but there is the ambition to go well below 2 degrees C and to pursue 1.5 degrees C. And the means of achieving this is through the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs as they're now known. And really good political momentum going to Paris. We had 187 NDCs submitted, and if all of those ambitions were totaled up, that gets us from a trajectory currently at about 3.6 degrees C at the end of the century to 2.7. That's a big improvement, but it's also really not enough. It's nowhere near 2 degrees C. But, well, several countries, several of the major emitters included CCS in their NDCs. But building on from those, the Paris Agreement also asks for countries to submit their long-term strategies for greenhouse gas mitigation. Now 6 countries have submitted those, and 5 of those have got CCS and CCUS within their long-term strategies looking to the mid-century. So that's good. So my colleagues at the International Energy Agency, for their energy technology perspectives in 2017, instead of stopping at the 2 degrees C, they've now they've changed their mapping of their scenarios. And their reference scenario now is not the business as usual 6 degrees C, but they've taken the NDC pledges at about 2.7 degrees C, and that's now their reference technology scenario, RTS. So how do we get from the RTS down to 2 degrees C? And their analysis repeats the exercise and looking at the role of all the different low carbon energy technologies and the proportional roles they play based upon the cost and deployment and deployability of those. And the role of CCS is increasing there, 14%. But the Paris Agreement target is actually well below 2 degrees C. So the IEA have created a B2DS scenario, which is aiming at about 1.75 degrees, midway between the ambition of 1.5 and the 2 degrees that had been the political agreement before. So to do that extra effort, CCS plays an even larger role proportionately in that, 32% of that extra heavy lifting. And why is it doing that? Why is extra CCS deployment required? Well, already in the 2 degrees scenarios, we've decarbonised the power sector virtually. And this new analysis, by the way, looks to 2060. We've decarbonised the power sector already. And the remaining sources of greenhouse gas emissions are industry and transport. So what we've got to do is combat and mitigate the emissions from industry and the emissions from transport. And this brings in an even, if you look at the purple wedge there, we're actually going into the carbon negative area. We're going below 0 there, an even larger role for bio-CCS as a negative emission technology in the power sector to compensate for other sources that are still emitting, and also we are effectively decarbonising the industrial sources as well. So sort of drawing to an end on this need for CCS and CO2 storage, it is, we need to decarbonise power by the mid-century. We know that. CCS enables us to do that along with other technologies. But in addition, we have to decarbonise industrial sources as well. And for major ones of those, iron and steel and cement, CCS is the only option to do that. Now also, we're talking about the scale-up here. The projects we have at the moment that John Scowcroft will talk about next, excellent projects proving the technologies, they're operating at the million-ton scale. We've got to get it to the gigaton scale to deliver these emissions reductions. And in fact, this is a matter of concern that we need to achieve this scale-up. The IEA, when they released this analysis, say that this is the achievement of 1.75 degrees, or B2DS as they call it, is technically feasible, but a formidable challenge. And we have to start now. And are we starting now? No, there is a concern about the level of investment in CCS. And so yesterday in Paris, there was a large meeting of the IEA's energy ministers and CEOs of large energy companies, especially the oil and gas companies. This is a very significant meeting on CCUS to address this issue of insufficient investment. It was chaired by Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of IEA, and by Rick Perry, the Secretary of State for Energy for the United States. They concluded this high-level meeting that there were 5 priority areas of action to boost CCS investment. These 5 areas are to harvest the low-hanging fruit, to build the CCS deployment and experience from the ground up from the easier CO2 sources that we have. Secondly, to tailor policies to shepherd CCS through this early deployment phase. Thirdly, to target multiple pathways to reduce costs of CCS through technology innovation and progressive finance arrangements. And we've got some projects that demonstrate the business models and finance that can come together. Fourthly, to build CO2 networks, to build the infrastructure needed to join up CO2 sources with CO2 stores. And fifthly, to strengthen partnerships and cooperation between industry and governments. So that was energy ministers and CEOs of energy companies agreeing to those actions yesterday. So to conclude, we've got to keep the CO2 out of the atmosphere. We've also got to keep the CO2 out of the oceans. And CCS and CO2 geological storage enables us to do that. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Good morning, everyone. 1, 2, testing. I've always wanted to be a roadie. Good morning, everyone. I'm John Scowcroft from the Global CCS Institute, and I really want to pick up from where Tim left off. I want to give you some information on where we actually are with CCS and what some of the challenges are. So first of all, just a brief introduction to the Institute. We're an international membership organization. We have offices in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Tokyo, headquarters in Melbourne, and we also have staff in the UK and in Norway. Our membership is governments, global corporations, small companies, research bodies, of whom CO2 GeoNet is one of our prize members, and NGOs. Our vision is, and we are on a new strategic mission, is to make CCS an integral part of a low emissions future and to accelerate the deployment and commercial viability of CCS. Originally, we talked very much about the demonstration and the deployment of CCS. We have come to the conclusion that demonstration is no longer necessary. The technologies are there, and we really need to push the deployment. Now, Tim showed you this chart. I want to put it in a rather more dramatic way. This is looking at the IPCC 5th Assessment Report and what happens if you don't have CCS in the mix. As Tim said, it's about an average of 138% more expensive, but really this, I think, gives you some indication of the real scale we're talking about. And as Tim said, we're now capturing some 37 million tons per annum. That is the 21 facilities in operation or under construction. And as Tim said, we have to move from millions of tons to gigatons. So what does that actually mean? Well, we've got to get there. We've got to go to 3.7 million tons of CO2 and stored by 2040. That is really an enormous change and scale up. And it is a measure of the challenge we're facing. So what do we actually have at the moment? These are the 37 projects around the world that are in either early development or operating. You'll see that we have 17 plants operating, 4 under construction, which we expect to be online sometime within the next 12 months. What you will see, 2 things you will see from that. One is the pipeline is somewhat skewed. We have 17 operating, we have 11 in early development, and really that pipeline ought to be the other way around. The early development ought to be the base of the pyramid, rather in some extent at the top of the pyramid. And one of the challenges we have is actually to replenish that pipeline. The other thing you'll note from that is that the majority of the plants under construction and operation are in North America. And to a very large extent, that is being driven by enhanced oil recovery and other things. The other thing to note is the way that China has now become the second most advanced nation in the deployment of CCS. Now, those are raw figures. Let's look at them in some more detail. This shows 2 things. One is the fact that, as I said, North America is the place where most CCS is in operation and in deployment. And the blue is the operating plants, the green is in construction, and advanced development, you will see there is some European ones. Now, the other thing, and the size of the bubbles is the amount of CO2 that's being captured and stored. Just a quick word about the Norway full chain, which we talk about as a Norway full chain. It is, and I'll come to it a bit later, but in fact, it is 3 projects, the capture from ammonia production, cement production, and from waste to energy. Now, the interesting thing there is, as Tim was saying, cement is one of those areas where capture is the only solution, and we have at least 1 plant, in fact, I think there are 2 plants, pilot plants, that are under construction or operation. Waste to energy, it is a city waste to energy plant, and the beauty of that one is it is replicable everywhere. There are waste to energy plants in most municipalities, and the other thing is most of the waste is in fact biomass, so the plant itself is to an extent a negative emissions plant. So that to me is one of the most encouraging developments. If we look about what technology, what industries those plants are on, the capture is on, the one thing you might notice is we spent a lot of time, and I used to work in the power industry, we spent a lot of time talking about CCS on power plant. If you actually look at power generation, there are only 2 plants in operation, and I'm sorry, this is a rather old, I've just noticed it is an old slide because Kemper County has now been abandoned. So we basically have Boundary Dam, Petronova, and Road, which is, again, only a couple of weeks ago has decided not to proceed, and then there's the Texas Clean Energy Project. So from that point of view, if you look at the 17 plants, power generation is not what's driving the deployment of CCS. It is hydrogen processing, natural gas, oil refining, fertilizer, and the most interesting one is iron and steel production, because the first steel plant opened just a year and nearly 2 years ago in Abu Dhabi on a steel plant, and is being used for enhanced oil recovery in Abu Dhabi. I'm going to be a bit parochial now. Having said that there's not very much going on in UK, there is, as I said, the full chain plant under development in Norway. There are other projects, and a lot of them are of relevance to storage because they are projects that will look at the transport and storage of CO2 from hubs around Europe. So there is the Dutch, Norwegian, UK on the top of the right, the cross-border transport. The Teesside Collective is a very interesting project because it's an old industrial site that has been developed. Most of the pipe work is there, and there is a storage site offshore in North Sea, and the objective there is actually to link all those sites together, capture the CO2 and store them in the North Sea. There are other ones, the Sapling, again Dutch, UK and Norway, and the Rotterdam backbone, which is going to build on the experience from Rode and capture CO2 from various plants in the Rotterdam port area. There are more around. There's a very interesting one, which is the Magnum project in the Netherlands, which is actually going to use, looking at the use of converting coal to hydrogen to burn in the power station and then store it in the North Sea. That's a project. My favourite little obscure one, those of you who understand and know the European system, there was a thing called the NER 300, which was designed to promote carbon capture in the power sector. It didn't. It failed. On the other hand, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, there is a geothermal power plant in Croatia, which actually got money from the NER 300 because it was a renewable project. But in actual fact, it is also capturing and re-injecting the CO2 from the geothermal plant. So we do actually have, rather bizarrely, a capture plant in the NER 300. Just to look at the Norwegian project, this is a very nice schematic from Statoil. I acknowledge the Statoil slides. I haven't discussed it with them, but I'm using it. So the capture will be onshore. The transport will be by ship to a holding store, and then there will be permanent storage in a very large site, aquifer some 50 kilometers offshore. The investigation on the site is being done by Statoil together with Total and Shell. Those three projects I referred to are will be capturing some 1.5 million tons per annum, and I am told that will use about 1% of the storage capacity of that field. So you will see that there is a lot of storage potential in the North Sea. That's another schematic of it. So it's ship. In fact, capture of the sites are then taken to the port by road, loaded onto the ship, taken around to the holding site, and then by pipeline offshore. Now, looking at storage, we have, on a global scale, identified plenty of storage capacity. And I think it's important here to say capacity doesn't mean, you have to be careful when you talk about capacity. That is what has been identified. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to prove that what the capacity of those storage sites are. But at that point of view, you were saying that we can say that theoretically there is no problem about storage around the world. Now, one of the problems, and coming on to some ideas about what we need to do, one of the problems is strong policy drives investment, and we need not necessary policy parity. It's an expression I'm not happy of, but we need the same treatment as other technologies have had. If you look at that, by the end of 2015, some $2.5 trillion have been invested in clean energy. And if you look at that very small line at the bottom, it says of that 20 billion went into CCS. Now, the scale of renewables investment is instructive from the point of view that it's being driven by policy. And as far as CCS is concerned, we haven't had the same sort of policy support. Clearly, enhanced oil recovery in North America has provided the business case for CCS, but the question we have to ask is how do we get CCS on the same curve as other low carbon technologies? So it's clear we can't tackle the scale of climate change challenge, as Tim has demonstrated, without CCS. We need effective policies which focus on this outcome. And we need strong leadership from decision makers, both in government and industry, to develop the full potential of CCS. So I invite you to join the underground. Thank you very much.
For this call to action and for making the point that CCS is real, CCS is here, and leading on very nicely to our next presentation from IPICA, Jim Herbertson. How do we scale up CCS and make it fly?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Oh, there's we go. I apologize in advance, but I have a bad cold. I've only just got my voice back, so I have my water and my strepsils, and I hope my voice lasts to the end of the presentation. So thank you, Kerry, for the introduction and the opportunity to speak at this event. I'd first like to introduce IPICA and then place carbon capture and storage very briefly in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, and then talk about the IPICA workshop that we had, and it was titled Making CCS Fly, which is the title of the presentation here. What is IPICA? It's the Global Oil and Gas Industry Association for Environmental and Social Issues. It was formed in 1974, following the launch of the United Nations Environment Programme, when the United Nations asked industry to set up channels of communication with it. To this day, we remain the primary representative of the global oil and gas industry with this body. In fact, IPICA is the only association involving both the upstream and the downstream of the oil and gas industry on environmental and social issues. Our members directly employ over 1 million people, and we account for over half of the global oil and gas production. And you can see the brands of our members. There are currently 62 members and associations. The Sustainable Development Goals are part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and were adopted by world leaders at the UN Summit in September 2015, so not that far away from when the Paris Agreement was also agreed. And IPICA itself has carried out a substantive exercise in producing an atlas that maps all 17 Sustainable Development Goals against the operations of the oil and gas sector. And you can see the report that we put out. If you go upstairs to our stand, the IPICA stand, we do have some copies. It's quite substantive. Otherwise, you can go on our website and have a look at the SDG Atlas on our website. I don't plan to talk about the SDGs in total, but I'd just like to bring out 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals. The first one is number 7, which is on access to affordable energy, and the second one is number 13, which is around climate action. So this slide, and I'm conscious of the fact that you probably can't see all of the detail, but this is a picture of the current energy system. And energy, of course, is a key driver of sustainable development, and without which most of the other sustainable development goals cannot be achieved. And yet today, 1.1 billion people do not have access to electricity, and about an estimated 2.8 billion people have to rely on solid fuels such as wood, charcoal, and animal dung for cooking and heating. And in this graph, you can see a breakdown of the total energy use, and the key big sectors here are transport, industry, as well as domestic. So the universal global challenge is to ensure access to sustainable modern energy whilst moving towards a global energy system with net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the second half of the century. And the oil and gas industry, of which IPIECA is a member, is committed to helping address this critical issue. And when it comes to affordable and clean energy, SDG 7, the way the oil and gas industry can help deliver that is by improving access to energy services through a shared infrastructure system, growing the share of natural gas in the energy mix, increasing the share of alternative energies and technologies in the global energy mix, and improving energy efficiency in operations and production. Switching now to SDG 13 on climate action. A low emissions future will look significantly different from the current energy system. It requires concerted scale-up, actions by government, business and civil society, and will need to ensure the transition does not sacrifice economic development, high employment or other social objectives. While there is no single pathway to net zero greenhouse gas emissions future, our IPICA Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals presents a number of actions that could contribute to this transition in order to stabilize atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions and global temperatures in line with the Paris Agreement. The oil and gas industry can contribute to SDG 13 by planning strategically for a net zero emissions future, self-assessing our carbon resiliency, strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to the impacts of climate change, and mitigating emissions within our own oil and gas operations. This includes minimizing flaring, minimizing methane emissions, and of course, developing CCS. Clearly, as we've heard before, and the challenge when you're the third speaker is that a lot of what you're going to say about carbon capture and storage has already been said by Tim and by John. But due to the size, the complexity, and growth of the energy system, and the time it takes to scale up solutions, the transition will likely play out over the course of the century with a continuing role for oil and gas. Pathways to a low emissions future will require energy efficiency, electrification of new sectors, and alternative energy solutions such as hydrogen or biofuels in hard to reach sectors. As Tim has already pointed out, in the IDA 2DS scenario, carbon capture and storage accounts for about 14% of the greenhouse gas reduction. And if you take that cumulatively from today until 2060, that's about 142 gigatons of CO2 that needs to be stored. And then if you go to the beyond 2 degree scenario in the IEA, that requires an additional 32% of contribution from CCS, which leads you to a total cumulative CCS between now and 2060 of 220 gigatons, which is a mind-boggling amount. And it's clear that CCS will need to be deployed not just in the power generation sector, but also in energy-intensive sectors such as steel, cement, and chemicals. And in order to achieve net zero emissions in the second half of the century, CCS is critical to the deployment of BECCS, the biomass to CCS process that allows for negative emissions. I know John has kind of covered deployment of CCS, but I do it from the perspective of the oil and gas industry. And I think it speaks to the point that Tim mentioned. When you have CEOs together, they do come out with these wonderful pronouncements, and then you look at them and say, that's all fine and dandy, but how am I going to do it? So when they talk about hanging fruit, let's pick up the low-hanging fruit first. I just say, for this slide here, which is a picture of the actual CCS in operation projects related to the oil and gas, then we're picking up two aspects of the low-hanging fruit. One is that where you have CO2 as acid gas in your natural gas development, you have to capture that CO2 anyway. So the costs associated in other projects like power generation, where you have costs of separation and capture, Those are much more easily dealt with in natural gas processing. So we have projects in Norway, Australia, and Brazil, where the CO2 from the natural gas is already separated and then re-injected or put into a saline aquifer. So that's one aspect of the low-hanging fruit. If you have to get rid of the CO2 anyway, why not do that by this process? And then secondly, if there is a suitable revenue stream for selling CO2, that's another way of adopting the low-hanging fruit approach. So on the left-hand side, you see the projects that tend to be in Canada and the United States. Again, those use EOR, enhanced oil recovery, for which you can sell your CO2 as a way of promoting those projects. And I know you can't see elements of this slide. You couldn't even see them on an IMAX, let alone the screen that's behind me. But I just wanted to point these out and to show that the role of the oil and gas is already very knowledgeable about CCS. The three pictures on the left are, one is the Quest project, where CO2 is taken from a hydrogen plant and used to provide low carbon energy in a oil sands development. The one in the middle is Chute Creek, the processing plant, an oil and gas processing plant, but that captures 7 million tons of CO2 already a year, so 7 million tons a year. So it's the largest capture process in the world, and that goes on to enhanced oil recovery. And I'm sure you're familiar with the picture at the bottom, which is the Sleipner project in the North Sea. But alongside that are pictures of seismic imaging, because one of the things that you have to do in order to promote CCS and get it off the ground is convince the public that you have the means and tools at your disposal to convince yourselves and themselves and regulators that the CO2 is there, that you can model the plume and you can actually follow the plume using sophisticated modeling techniques. And that will be kind of quite important when we move forward, that you need to be able to say, if I'm scaling up from, at the moment the projects are 1 to 2 million tons a year of storage, 30 million tons a year in total, and John and Tim have talked about moving up to the gigaton, then you're going to need a lot more storage locations that you should need to accurately classify, and you will need to be able to monitor and convince people you're accurately monitoring in the order of tens and hundreds of millions of tons a year. So technology is needed to ease that process. On the right-hand side, you won't be able to see them, but there are just two pictures of maybe there are other technology approaches that can be used in order to get CCS off the ground. The top one is linking together a natural gas generation system with a molten carbonate fuel cell. So this is in the pilot stage, but again, if you're trying to provide electricity, then is there a different way of providing electricity with CCS than the process and pathway that people have been following historically? And then the picture at the bottom is a nice picture of a gas-fired power station in the Netherlands, but there is a project underway to how can you couple that with a process called steam reforming. And steam reforming is where you take natural gas, separate it into hydrogen and CO2, and if you can then take the CO2 and then inject it into the North Sea in a storage location, you can then use that hydrogen, and that can be used for power generation or it can be used for heating. And again, that process can be scaled up, it can be used in a modular fashion, and it can be replicated on a worldwide basis. So not only is the oil and gas sector already operating CCS, it's actually looking at different types of technology to move it along in different processes. Pardon me. A bit about IPIECA. As an organisation, we have been involved with carbon capture and storage for a good number of years. Our first workshop you can see, actually it is readable, was in 2003. And we've had a series of workshops then, culminating in the latest one, which is in September of this year. And I'd just like to kind of pick out some of the themes from the workshop that we had 6 weeks ago. I won't kind of read through the bullet points here, but we do have the agenda and the information on our website. But there were participants from IPICA member companies, which is oil and gas industry, from academia such as University of Oxford and MIT, from international organizations, some of whom are represented here, and from governmental agencies such as the United States Department of Energy and Natural Resources of Canada, and from other industrial sectors such as steel that will be part of the deployment of CCS as we move along. The main topics we covered are listed in the slide. I won't go, in the interest of time, I won't go through them, but I'd just like to touch upon two of the topics that I'd like to bring out here, and they're consistent with what John and Tim have been saying. And these are around information and collaboration and business models. I know this is a busy slide, but there's a lot around information and collaboration. But I just want to kind of mention in passing that one of the things that kind of stood out in our discussions is that sort of industry in various guises is working very hard on deploying and looking at further opportunities to deploy CCS. But one of the big challenges within this is the second bullet point, is how can we ensure that CCS continues to have a key position within government strategies? Because at the end of the day, it is the governments that set the policy, it's the governments that provide the framework within which industry and other actors operate. And these are the people we really do need to get on board. So the question we kind of put out there and we haven't resolved, because if all of our questions had been resolved, we would be moving forward quicker than we are, is how can we help governments think about CCS in their mid-century strategies for the Paris Agreement? Now, I understand the process is they have to finalize their mid-century strategies by 2020, and it was heartening to see from one of Tim's slides that some of the countries are already doing that. But when you kind of look at the period in question, the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in this period are China, the United States, the European Union, and India. So those are the four key national governments that you would want to get hold of and make sure that CCS is fully embedded and fully part of their strategy. Because normally once you have a strategy, you then have to develop a plan. And a plan, once you develop it, you start actioning it. So if we can kind of grab hold of the governments and get them to fully embed CCS in what they're trying to achieve, then that adds as an extra impetus into moving things forward. And the final slide was about business models. There are a whole pile of things you can say about business models, but the second bullet point was one of the ones we did spend some time thinking about, and I see it's been brought up already, that when you look at, it's not just power generation, it is industrial sectors, you may say, well, actually, we need a different perspective on what is the best way of getting the infrastructure in place. It's not point-to-point, big power station, big pipeline, big storage location. But how do we then, if you're thinking about smaller chemical plants and other point sources, they can't justify infrastructure on their own. They don't have the money to be able to do that, and also to be able to do the initial characterization of storage locations, which would be quite an expensive endeavor. So what is the business model that would allow you to have these spoken hubs, and can you actually separate capture and storage into different businesses rather than have it all pass through as an integrated system? So no easy answers, but our workshop sort of touched upon that. We had all the people trying to think of ways of pushing that forward. So those were the kind of the two key themes that I wanted to bring out here, which is the collaboration, the mid-century strategies, and different business models rather than the classical one that people have been using. So that was a kind of a snapshot of our Making CCS workshop, and I think I'm out of time from Kerry. So thank you very much.
Very much, Jim. I think in the interests of time we need to move forward to our final two speakers who will give us some interesting and exciting ideas about adding value to CO2 and utilization of CO2 as part of enabling storage and as part of permanent storage through innovative building materials.
It's just in the late segment. Either the space bar or the arrows. You can do this, or use the arrows.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Thomas Weber. I'm president of Jupiter Oxygen Corporation. Jupiter Oxygen Corporation is a US-based clean energy technology company. We are specialized in oxy-combustion applications for industrial energy efficiency and also cost-effective carbon capture from coal-fired power plants, but also biomass and biofuel power plants. My topic here to support the event is synergies for oxy-combustion, carbon capture, and enhanced coal bed methane recovery. And I also wanted to mention that Jupiter Oxygen is a member of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and this is how we come to the United Nations climate conferences on a steady base. I think the challenge that we have heard from the previous speakers clearly is that projections show for the global energy use in 2040, still 75% of fossil energy being used and only 25 non-fossil. So for us, clearly, the solution is carbon capture, utilization, and storage at scale. First, we can address the large point sources like coal-fired power plants and industrial facilities. And secondly, there are already a lot of carbon utilization options at scale available. Enhanced oil recovery, there are projections from advanced resources out that the US, Mexico, and China alone could utilize 40 billion tons of CO2 with the technologies known in EOR, probably much more. Also, by the way, and CO2 EOR's life cycle assessment shows it's clearly lower, has a clearly lower carbon footprint than primary oil production. So there's definitely an advantage to go for CO2 EOR. Enhanced coal bed methane recovery we discover is a great option for storage of CO2 in countries like India, China, and US too, with tens of billions of tons of CO2 being stored potentially. Those options will build a bridge to other solutions that are coming rapidly up from innovative companies like Mr. Kuse, who is speaking after me, for reuse in materials and elsewhere. So we are very hopeful that there will be a lot more to be seen on reuse of carbon in the future. But until then, we have to build the bridge. So Jupiter Oxygen Corporation did work over 10 years with the US Department of Energy on a clean coal pathway that is cost effective. As you may know, oxy-combustion eliminates the nitrogen out of the combustion equation, concentrates the CO2 in the flue gas, and makes it easier to capture it and more cost-effective. Our process specifically increases also efficiency in the boiler by roughly 5%, which gives us an edge. Now, all what you can see from the schematic, the combustion products are controlled and available to be sold in the market. If you can sell not only CO2, but in our case, from the air separation unit N2, you might be close to business case without incentives necessarily from the state and the government. So our activities internationally have focused in China and India on enhanced coal bed methane recovery as a great option for CO2 utilization. Again, there's a power plant or industrial facility involved where you not only capture CO2 but also have the N2 available from oxy-combustion that is injected both into coal deep seams, coal bed methane seams. CO2 adsorbs into the coal and pushes out the methane. Methane is reused. Very attractive for China and India because they are rare in domestic natural gas. They're very eager to do CBM, and with enhanced coal bed methane recovery, we might be doubling the production for them. So we have one initiative ongoing currently in Western China, Xinjiang province. We expect first results in April 2018 on the oxy-combustion retrofit of a 55 megawatt power plant and the CO2 utilized for enhanced coal bed methane recovery. We have also assessed the markets in India. We found a lot of good ECBM potential there, substantial sources of CO2 from industries close to ECBM sites. The industry is very well prepared, as we heard from IPICA, to support this effort and provide the necessary infrastructure. And that's a tremendous business opportunity. We have assessed those locations, as we've seen in the map. The storage potential from those initial CBM, ECBM sites could be 800 million tons of CO2. The overall potential in India is probably 10 times as much. We would need, for this initial stage, 10,000 megawatts of low-emission coal-based power based on a retrofit to serve that market with CO2. Potentially it would be 100 gigawatt. 100 gigawatt will bring down the cost substantially. It's all about lowering the cost and establish carbon capture technologies. It has to be, it is driven from enhanced coal bed methane recovery. That's clearly the driver. But as a side effect, we control substantial amounts of CO2. Power companies also are looking for additional markets. So that is all helpful. So because of the time, I'm rushing a bit through, but in conclusion, we feel that the CCUS strategies need to be attractive to local businesses and industries to guarantee wider deployment. If they pick it up, then we have a chance that it's going to spread quickly. The location is key for the success of a demonstration project, and the industry engagement in emerging economies specifically needs recognition and financial support from the UNCCC and the Clean Climate Fund. There shouldn't be any discussion that should not be funded and supported. It's clearly part of the low carbon solutions. Multilateral development banks have to step up and finance initial stages, and hopefully sometime carbon markets help to support that effort. But overall, we feel that there's market-driven possibilities to bring this quicker at scale. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Callie. I'm the chairman of E5, the European Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and I'm also member of a small company that recently formed itself called Clean Carbon Technology, which was founded around the developments and ideas to create a new material paradigm by making and utilizing CO2 to make carbon fibers. And I'm going to briefly line out in this presentation what this is all about. Carbon fibers production is very energy intensive, as you know, so one of the basic ideas is to use sunlight to actually produce the carbon fiber directly with sunlight without using electricity, and making the process of production of carbon fibers 2 times more efficient than it is today. You know that carbon fibers are used already in many applications, like in the automotive sector, in the aviation application area. Carbon fibers is already successfully in use. The big question is still if carbon fiber find its way into the building and construction area, but recently in Germany there has been development honored to make carbon concrete. So carbon is replacing the steel to reinforce cement. So carbon fibers is really progressing into attractive and large-scale applications. we see a way to reach a real carbon negativity by using natural CO2, let it be converted by algae into algae oil, and the conversion of the algae oil into some precursor fibers like Dralon fibers seems to be possible. The energy being used from direct sunlight is 2 times more efficient, and as a waste product produces electricity on top, because the heat is going to be used to produce the energy to drive the processes, the production processes. And then the carbon fiber can be combined with minerals to form buildings, bridges, cars, and what else, where we need today CO2 positive materials like steel, cement, and aluminum. Later on, after the usage of these materials, they can be stored away underground safely, because the carbon fiber is in a solid state that keeps its state for millions of years, which is even more stable than coal. So we have done some research and development on the processes, and we have identified 8 different processes to convert algae oil into the Dralon precursor fibers that are going to be going through a pyrolysis process driven by sunlight to actually produce the carbon fibers. And these processes do not need necessarily any CO2 credentials. The return of investment that we can calculate today is about 10%, very attractive to investors. My colleagues have been presenting what is doable with CO2 today. I have to say at this point, this is not existing today, but we know it will work. So we are taking a look into the future, what could be done with CO2. On the other hand, you know that algae farming is already being done. For example, here, a large-scale algae farm in Australia to win beta-carotene. These algae farms in desert areas like in Algeria, Mexico, Australia, is a projection how these systems could look like. The future carbon fiber production could be also driven by sunlight in Algeria, Iran, Mexico, Chile, China, India, and also maybe in the US. Another thing we want to mention at this point is there is an alternative to replace even cement, and we think that is possible by using stone like granite. I have a sample here that I'm going to show you later. Granite is available in vast amounts around the planet. Here example from Africa, very high quality granite comes from India and Africa and other countries around the world. Granite has about the same specific weight like aluminum. This is amazing to most scientists and engineers, but it's a fact. And granite has also about the same E modulus like aluminum. So you think granite is breakable under pressure? It is actually flexible, and the flexibility will be frozen in by the carbon fibers combination with the granite. The pressure strength of granite is 4 times better than that of concrete. And here are some examples what could be done with carbon fibers and granite. For example, a railway sleeper has been tested for 10 million load reversals without any breakage up to the load that the German Deutsche Bahn is requesting from such kind of systems. Granite can be used to produce machinery like measurement instruments being used in the steel industry that you can show here. So it's amazing that even 2-3 millimeter plates can be made from carbon fibers in combination with granite. Even round shapes are possible with the material without any problems. The energy to produce parts in the building industry at the same strength like steel have about half the weight than the steel and half of the production energy just using carbon fibers already available today. So in this respect, we are talking about something that is even possible today. We have even built prototypes for house walls and so on, frames for solar panels, and if we project this into the future and would produce as many carbon fibers as needed to replace 1.8 gigatons of steel that the world demand needs today per year, we would need about 1.1 gigaton of carbon fibers, and if those would be made from CO2, from atmospheric CO2, we would capture and store at the end of the day 4 gigatons per year of CO2 within the building material and replacing CO2 intensive building materials at the same point in time. Steel production today accounts yearly for at least between 1.6, depending on the figures we take, depending 1.6 gigaton of CO2 and 3 gigatons of CO2. Cement accounts for more than 4 gigatons of CO2. If you would replace all of this by carbon fibers and granite, we would withdraw 4 gigatons of CO2 per year, which would mean that in 2400 we could withdraw all presently being blasted into the atmosphere emissions of the past 200 years. So thank you very much for your attention. We think it's a very interesting idea to make carbon fibers out of CO2, replace existing building materials, and use granite, salt water, carbon dioxide, deserts and sunlight in the future to drive our industry, because these are all limitless, unlimited resources. And now I'm going to show you the flexibility of the granite being stabilized by carbon fibers.
So thank you very much, Callie, for this interesting presentation on a potential future use to replace our carbon-intensive materials with friendlier alternatives. And I think this is a very exciting way to look at what we could do in the future. And I think it's good to welcome all the ideas for how we can use CO2 in the future, how we can add value to CO2, and how this, of course, does not replace the need for storage, which you very clearly made this point. And it is just part of our idea that we must use all of the options that we have available to meet our climate targets, because we are desperately running out of time and desperately running out of space to deal with our CO2 in the atmosphere. We look like we are heading for 4 degrees change unless we do take some very drastic steps. And I would also like to note that the presentations will be made available through the CO2 GeoNet COP23 website. I've asked the presenters for their permission, so when we have permission to upload those, we will make them available so that you can go through them in more detail and read all the small text that you can't see on our little television. And I would now like to try to have a short discussion. I am not sure if we're overrunning into the next side event or if there's somebody going to come and kick us off the stage. But until they do, I would like to ask Tim Dixon, John Scowcroft, Ton Wilderborg from CO2 GeoNet, Professor Uwe Arnold from the European Business Council for Sustainable Energy, Jim Herbertson from IPIECA, if your voice will hold out, and Professor Tan Chung Song from the Taiwan CCSUA Association, which is we're very excited that they have come all this way to join us and to add to our discussion on CO2 utilization and CO2 storage. Thank you.
I'm going to sit here. No, it's okay. Have I made it go? No, no. Yes, yes, okay. I should have made it's a help. Don't go anywhere. I think we outnumber the audience now.
It always helps if you switch the microphone on. So I would like to ask, does anybody have any questions, or shall I challenge the panel first? So maybe I will start by asking the panel. So for me, one of the key questions are, what are these low-hanging fruit? So what is the best way? So you have, what should we say, a minute each to tell me, what do you think are the low-hanging fruit? What do you think will really get CCS moving?
I'll go first. Am I on? Yes. A negotiator here once said, if the low-hanging fruit is too high, chop the tree down. But there is plenty of low-hanging fruit. I think one of the problems is, I mean, if you look at the Norwegian project, the ammonia plant is basically a process that produces pure CO2 as a byproduct. And is currently being vented. If you look at the steel plant in the UAE, the steel process used, DRE, produces virtually pure CO2 as a byproduct. Therefore, the only cost there is compression. That is expensive, but not as expensive as capture. I think the issue, and I'll probably take more of a minute here, is not so much where the low-hanging fruit is as far as the production of CO2 is concerned, is actually those are pretty small quantities, and the challenge is to have an infrastructure in place that will enable that low-hanging fruit to be garnered and transported, which brings us to the major issue, I think, which is has come up a number of times, is we need an infrastructure, and how are we going to incentivize that to be built? I tend to say to myself, governments build roads and railways, or they finance roads and railways in one way or another. What we're talking about is another highway process. And we need to look around the sort of policy incentives that governments could put in place to encourage people to build that. So, Gary, the answer is there's plenty of low-hanging fruit. The problem is to get the low-hanging fruit to market.
So just to add to that, is the mic working? Let's just thank you. So and John's absolutely right there, and it's where the CO2 is already being separated from the processes to make the product suitable for market, and natural gas production. Many times that contains a high level of CO2. That's what we see in the Norwegian case with Sleipner. And we have new gas fields likely to come online in the future with even higher proportions of CO2 in the gas. And those will be low-hanging fruit, and also the gas production aspects, they are in locations with very likely to have suitable geology for the CO2 storage at the same location by the fact that it's trapped the natural gas there to start with. So I'd add that to the list of low-hanging fruit that John's identified, and those in a sense need less infrastructure put in place to start those.
Okay. Yes.
So we have a question from the audience. May I give you the microphone, or do you want to shout?
Hi, Belinda Perriman from Teesside Collective. How do you reconcile what you were just saying about low-hanging fruit and relatively pure CO2 with our message that we need to do many things, many sectors all at once to get that cost reduction that we're all looking for? So it's the low-hanging fruit, but you want to pick the really lovely, juicy fruit a bit higher up, which is to have CCS for hydrogen production from gas, and to collect from other industries that don't have pure CO2, and of course from power stations. So I'm looking for all the fruit. So how do you reconcile that with your message of just picking the low-hanging fruit? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to be a bit of a nitpicker. I was only asked about low-hanging fruit, but you're quite right. I mean, there are some easy wins there, and I think they can sort of drive the need for that kind of the infrastructure. I take Tim's point about for natural gas, very often that you don't need an infrastructure, but if you're looking at on land, if you're looking at areas like Teesside, like the Humber Valley, where you have large industrial complexes with a variety of CO2 sources, some of which are easier to capture than others, it does seem to me that if you concentrate on those first ones, you can then start driving through to start encouraging the others that they need to join in as well. I put it in that way. So that is my sort of rather vague answer to you. Is the low-hanging fruit can actually start driving the design to get the ladder further up the tree.
Yeah. So can I add to that? That there's no conflict there, and John's absolutely right. And by using the low-hanging fruit for the CO2 supply and developing the storage sites, as we are seeing with Smeaheia, the new site being proved up for Norway, the existing sources will be 1%, as John said, of that. That's got a very large storage capacity that your other sources then can come in and connect into. And storage resource development does take time to characterize the geology and prove it up. You can see the scenario where you prove up single reservoirs with multiple supplies of CO2 coming into those. So the low-hanging fruit of CO2 capture enable those to start that storage resource development.
Just to continue the discussion on the metaphor, which I very much like, and the remark of John on putting the ladder higher up to harvest all the fruit, I think there is also a possibility to consider in doing this is the time-wise scaling up of this network, is that you would first look at storage sites which are relatively close to the high purity CO2 sources, and then that infrastructure could be part of a larger infrastructure. So what is first a backbone could turn into a satellite pipeline for even a bigger infrastructure. So you build up in an organic way I think maybe also with a staged financial decision-making process towards a full network, for example for Teesside or for Rotterdam and Teesside, looking into the northern part of the North Sea. So I think that's of course an engineering challenge and financial challenge, but I think there is a way to overcome this.
Hi, if I could just build on an analogy with an aphorism. It is said that the perfect is the enemy of the good. So if you're waiting to build a perfect infrastructure that captures every source that you can think of and have an algorithm that plots it all out and it's just wonderful, you'll be waiting forever. So you're better off starting with, as we use the analogy of the low-hanging fruit, the low or not so long low-hanging fruit, and get the infrastructure started. And then as people build on that, they will either say, right, we can adapt it, or we'll actually, as you see in a lot of other endeavours, we'll build something better alongside it. But if you're waiting for the perfect, you'll be waiting for a long time. So let's start with what we've got. And I know we only talk about the low-hanging fruit because that was the first bullet point in the the sort of press release from the IEA, but there were some other ideas in there that may be worth exploring, not just the low-hanging fruit, but start with what is practical and build on that.
Okay, I would like to add the metaphor of the low-hanging fruit, to my mind, is a little bit dangerous, because in early autumn, maybe you concentrate on the low-hanging fruit, thinking about the high-hanging fruit, you can collect them later, but in the winter they might not longer be very attractive. So
just pick them off the ground.
you pick them off the ground, but they are a little bit ugly then. So I think starting with the so-called low-hanging fruit, it's a question of scale. So already available storage capacities, CCS and so on, doesn't mean that the high-hanging fruit, CCU, the value creation based upon carbon and carbon dioxide, is postponed. We need this to be started, we need the process to be started immediately. And in utilization of carbon dioxide, there are again some early or closer paths to be used, and some paths which might be a little bit more complicated. What Akua introduced was certainly a path which is very promising because it's using biochemical transformation, algae for instance, and whether or not the final product, which is fairly expensive today, the carbon fiber, is the only product. I think algae are producing so much, like nutrients for instance, and some fuel type products, that this development should be started immediately. And it could also be an offer for areas which are non-arable, which are not the typical areas of chemical clusters. So it's really an offer of developing industry, an industry based upon algae technologies, which might be attractive for regions like Northern Africa and Southern Europe, where other possibilities are not the primary choice. So this is for me not a low-hanging fruit, it's not a high-hanging fruit, but it's an urgent fruit which should be collected right now.
Okay, but in Taiwan we have a lot of sunlight and CO2, so we use capture CO2 to cultivate microalgae. Now, two companies are using this one, and we can extract nutrients and healthcare products. Also, we just use some technologies to extract lipids as the precursor for production of biodiesel. Okay, for CO2 utilization, we also have 3 companies in Taiwan utilize CO2 as feedstock to produce chemicals. One company is to use CO2 to produce ethylene oxide, ethylene carbonate, and the other one is ethylene carbonate to be react with benzene ring chemicals to produce polyether carbonate. And also one company using CO2 as feedstock to produce acetic acid. So the production rate is, annual production rate is 690,000 tons of acetic acid. So it consumes about 200,000 tons of CO2 each year. So these three companies consume 300,000 tons of CO2 each year. But for the carbon fiber, we also evaluate this process. But this time, I think it has potential. But so far, we just concentrate production of chemicals and energy products. We want to produce methanol, which can be used as a energy storage chemicals. So this is what we intend to do.
I would actually like to jump in if I may ask a quick question. Professor Arnold, you mentioned utilization as not a low-hanging fruit. I mean, in my mind, utilization for enhanced oil recovery for chemicals, it seems quite a low-hanging fruit to me, perhaps because it is not my field of expertise. And all I'm thinking is, what are these low-hanging fruit in terms of utilization, but also considering how they could lead on to storage?
Well, if you apply this scale, low and high hanging, it's really a definition of the scale. What is low and what is high? As Koyakusa already presented, a lot of these partial processes are already existing. A lot of the capacities needed to convert CO2 via algae into the precursor and then to produce the carbon fiber out of it. A lot of these capacities are spread all over the world in chemical parks. There are some connecting processes which are necessary to connect the whole process chain, but for instance the production of propylene from methanol is not a new thing. The production of acrylonitrile from propylene is not a new thing, and there are a lot of capacities. Maybe these capacities now are not even completely used right now, because we have a lot of capacities in chemical parks which are not completely used. So this is really a problem of organization of a new industry, a carbon-based industry. And whether this is low or high-hanging is a different question. We know it's possible. There have been other cooperations of different partners, not just one company, many different companies who have different capacities. They should organize. Maybe we have to help them to organize so that a complete process chain is established, and then we have low-hanging fruit, because then we have a product and we have the infrastructure to produce the product.
Take the microphone. There's a lot of noise. I have more talking to do today, so I shouldn't use my whole voice. Hi, I'm Miriam for the Center for Carbon Removal, and we are a North American nonprofit that is focused on doing many of the things we've talked about today. So it was so great to hear from all of you speakers, many of whom I'm meeting for the first time. And I'm really excited to continue collaborating with, because exactly as Professor Arnold just pointed out, we need to be collaborative in our messages, and also collaborative across industries to share lessons learned. And to that end, I guess I wanted to make a couple of comments, if that's okay, and I'll leave them to you guys to respond. One is that there's another negative emissions event that I'll put some cards out about, that will be talking more about CCS and what the US is doing as one of the leaders in carbon capture and storage. Second is part of the way we have built our CO2 pipeline infrastructure, which is nowhere near sufficient at this point, but we do have some infrastructure built, is by utilizing enhanced oil recovery and getting those businesses to build those pipelines. I know much less about the political situation in Europe, but just as an anecdote to share. I feel like I had one other thing. Oh, yes, and if you guys want to talk more about utilization, we're standing up a business incubator for carbon utilization businesses to help them move from concept to full investment, in order to both help those businesses and help investors realize things. And I'd love to talk to you all about your great ideas and advice. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear about what's going on in your world around utilization outside of EOR and what you guys are sort of tracking, whether it's the shoe made from carbon or cements that are being enhanced by the injection of CO2.
It will be a long conversation. I'd just like to make a couple of observations. One is the figure that Jim was quoting about the gigatons that will need to be stored by 2060 is really mind-boggling. And I just asked myself, how much will utilization, on the assumption that the utilization is permanent storage, will that contribute to achieving that? Yeah, well, thank you. But I think the next point I want to make, particularly about EOR, is that one of the things that why CCS has been driven in North America by EOR is the fact that natural occurring CO2 has been used for EOR for quite some time, and the pipeline work is in place. Now in Europe we have two problems. One is if we're going to do EOR, it's going to be offshore in the North Sea, and there is very little experience of that, if any. And so we have two problems. We don't have the pipeline structure, and we're also going to do it in a difficult place. So I think whilst experience is translatable in many cases, in some cases it raises a new series of issues.
Okay, I think the utilization discussion is still going to run and run, and I have to say for me in Europe it's not yet decided what are the best utilization options and will this definitely lead to storage, because in the USA it seems to be encouraging storage, but I don't know in Europe can we really get storage going with utilization. I hope it can help, and I really hope that we get lots of storage, because I really think that we need to store our CO2 desperately. And I'm going to steal the chair's privilege here, and I'm going to ask Professor Tan about storage options for Taiwan, because we've talked about utilization, but for Taiwan they have to think about their storage options, because there's not much in terms of oil and gas. So we have to know what do you need to do, and what do you think are the next actions?
Okay, the problem is in Taiwan because we are 98% of energy is from import, and about 46% of electricity comes from coal, and 36% from gas in the next year. So we need to do CCS and the CO2 utilization. The reason is we want to carry out EOR, but in Taiwan, we are lack of energy resources, so we cannot do that. So we just want to assure that if we can store CO2 in cement safely, then probably there's a possibility to store more CO2. But before we can convince local governments and the residents to store or to inject CO2 in safe. So far, so we are more concentrating on CO2 utilization. Okay, that's why. So that's why I like to cooperate with Callie, just how to inject CO2 safely into cement, because we are lack of geological structural storage. Okay. But for the initial estimation, the CO2 storage potential is about 9 billion tons of CO2, okay, and up to 6-8 billion tons of CO2. But we need to need a more accurate estimation. Okay. So far, the most important thing is we need the government support. If government does not support carbon reduction, well, we face some problems, especially. So we paid attention to communicate with local governments and residents. Also, we just cooperate with some foreign agencies like NETL to build up injection monitoring systems, and also we studied the model, the diffusion model on the ground. So this is what we are doing. We just want to prepare everything. Then if the government say, and local governments agrees us to inject, then we are ready to to store CO2, okay?
So I would like to draw the event to a close. We've already overrun a little. Collier, you want to add one last comment? Very short.
One last comment to answer your question. I think we shouldn't trade CCS against CCU. We should stop this. We need both. That is important. And if we look at CCU, we need to analyze which kind of CCU are we promoting, and look at the longevity of the products we make from CO2. If you produce a shoe, it may be back in the system in 5 years or 10 years from now. If you pump CO2 into cement, it will be back in the system in 20, 50 or 100 years from now. So we have to analyze carefully which kind of CCU we are promoting.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to thank all of our experts for giving their time, including a little bit extra because we started late. So thank you very much to everybody. And I would just like to say I really feel that these opportunities to share knowledge, to discuss how to move CCS and other low carbon technologies forward is absolutely critical. And I think it's been wonderful to try to make links here at COP23 between different parties who are all trying to achieve the same goal, a better future, and to find how best we can work together. So please thank the panelists in the conventional way.